Sequels can be a strange thing. Sometimes sequels are very obvious, both in naming and plot continuation. Other times, it's a little harder to figure out if games are connected, and if so, how that connection works. In some ways, that's true of Hexen, the game that I'm looking at today, although it is pretty easy to figure out that it is connected to Heretic since they're packaged together in the modern re-release of these two games. However, they don't share naming conventions, and while they're connected, it's not quite as simple as the story continuing from the end of Heretic. Add in the fact that we later had both a Hexen 2 and a Heretic 2, and it makes the whole endeavor slightly confusing. Regardless of the confusion, I had enjoyed Heretic quite a bit. Does Hexen live up to the quality of the first game, surpass it, or not quite reach the same level? Let's find out. Hexen is a first-person shooter that was developed by id Software. It was originally released in 1995, but I'm playing the re-release that was from 2025 and developed by Night Dive Studios, which also includes two expansions, Death Kings of Dark Citadel and Vestiges of Grandeur. The re-release is available on PC, PlayStation 4 and 5, Xbox Series X and S, and the Nintendo Switch. It currently costs $14.99 at full price on all storefronts. In terms of age rating, it is rated T for teen due to violence and blood. Hexen's story doesn't follow the protagonist of Heretic. Instead, Hexen is focused on a conflict with the second of the three Serpent Riders. Heretic took place on the world of Parthoris and focused on the battle against Desperal. Hexen instead takes place on the world of Kronos, and your battle is against the Serpent Rider Corax. Much like Heretic, the story isn't a huge focus of the game. There are a few cinematics throughout that help present the story, the most significant of these being at the start and end of the game. Each level of the main game does have you interact with Corax a little, usually with him taunting you that you won't survive and that he's going to be victorious and things like that. The expansions kind of continue the story, but I found these expansions to be weaker in narrative connection than Heretic's connection, and that wasn't a particularly strong connection either, but at least it had some story that made somewhat sense as opposed to these ones. They're basically excuses to give you more levels to play and work through, but don't really add story of any significance. While the story of Hexen wasn't amazing, I do feel like it did take some steps to better incorporate the story into the game. This was still a time that FPS games didn't really have a lot of narrative, so all things considered, it was a step in the right direction. Having some cinematics in the game and some minor interactions with the big bad was definitely an improvement over just having text after a completed episode and the intro story being relegated to the manual. In terms of gameplay, Hexen tried some fun things to mix up the Doom Heretic formula, but I found a lot of these changes to be a mixed bag. The basic formula is still there. You move around a level killing enemies with your selection of weapons and while trying to find the exit so that you can move to the next level. It does have the Heretic ability to look up and down, which I feel like overall aiming in Hexen is a little bit better than Heretic. It still sometimes goes a little weird on you, but I felt that Hexen had a little bit more precise aim overall. Hexen also carries over the Heretic inventory system, which allows for you to carry power-ups and use them throughout the level. Sadly, one of my favorite power-ups from Heretic, the Tome of Power, is not part of the game. However, I still found the inventory a helpful aspect of the game, particularly for healing purposes. So while there is still much that is similar, let's move to the big differences. The first is that there are three classes that you can choose from. You can choose a fighter, a cleric, or a mage, and each class has different stats and a unique set of 4 weapons. Their speeds are different, how much damage they take whenever they get hit, things like that are all different. Now in the original Hexen, you couldn't switch classes, but the re-release has added an alter to levels that allows you to switch to another class mid-game. While I liked the class system idea, there were some things that I didn't like too much. I felt like the melee combat was a bit too difficult to pull off without getting damaged. I started off playing the warrior, but just felt like every conflict either took too long because I was trying to avoid damage and then damage them and, do things like that, or that if I tried to be more aggressive and get through things quicker, then I took a lot of damage in the process. So it just was something I never really found a good rhythm to. Maybe that's just a skill issue on my part, but it's just something that didn't feel intuitive and a lot of fun to try to figure out. I also didn't love that your arsenal was limited to only 4 weapons, one of which you don't wind up getting for quite some time because you have to find parts to it to be able to put it together, and then you finally get your most powerful weapon. It just, I don't know, I felt like we needed at least one more weapon into the arsenal to kind of make it feel a little bit better. Another difference was the level design of Hexen. Instead of following the path of Doom that Heretic took, Hexen instead had 5 hub worlds. Each of these hub worlds had a number of different maps that were connected to one another. This would involve traveling to the various maps of the hub multiple times in order to progress to the exit. This felt like an attempt to make a more cohesive world, but I'm not sure that it really worked. Maps were often only connected by portals, which worked against any feeling of cohesion. It also had the unfortunate side effect of requiring a lot of backtracking. While the re-release does give you some symbols on the map to help you figure out where you need to go, it makes for a bit too much backtracking that gets old pretty quick. And and this all just made my experience with the game feel a bit mixed. It felt like there were attempts to move the genre forward here, but that they didn't really work all that well. I particularly felt this with the hub world level design, but there were other aspects of the gameplay that I didn't particularly enjoy either. I found a number of the enemies here to be far more annoying than the enemies from Heretic, particularly the centaurs and slothars, reavers, and the worst of the bunch in my opinion, the stalkers. So while I acknowledge that Hexen tried some interesting ideas with its gameplay, it didn't always particularly land with me. Hexen is still good, but I found it less enjoyable than its predecessor on a number of levels. In terms of art style, I felt like Hexen was a bit bland feeling. It was a pretty dark and bleak world with everything feeling very muted. Even when there was color like stained glass, it was dimmer than it was in Heretic. While I somewhat understand the choice to make a world taken over by evil and corruption to be presented as dim and lacking in vibrancy, I found myself wishing for a bit more color or at least variation in the world of Hexen. There's just far too many stone walls and cave walls and just stuff that just didn't really look all that nice in my opinion. It's maybe cohesive for world building, but it just didn't make for very fun art style that I could really appreciate. In terms of sound, I found the game to be probably better overall. Soundtrack wasn't particularly memorable for me, but it went well with the game. Sound effects were also done well enough, but again, there wasn't really any particular standout. One thing I did kind of notice about these sound effects is that sometimes there were like a lot of noises going on in the background. Maybe there was some sort of mechanism that was constantly active, or enemies that were behind a wall or a door that you could hear but couldn't actually do anything with yet. And so like constantly hearing those in the background sometimes would get a little annoying, but like that's probably my biggest complaint, and it's really not that big of a complaint. I feel like I should have liked Hexen a lot more than I did. It tries to move the series forward by adding a class system and approaching levels from a different angle. The problem was I just didn't really enjoy these changes all that much. Classes were okay, but I think I would have liked them to have one or two more weapons each. Levels were interesting, but required too much backtracking and didn't really achieve the feeling of a more cohesive world for me. Throw in changes that I didn't really enjoy, like the absence of the Tome of Power and more frustrating enemies, and it just wound up being an experience that I didn't enjoy quite as much. Not that I didn't enjoy it at all. It just wound up not being nearly as enjoyable as my time with Heretic. With these mixed feelings on the game, I'm giving Hexen a 7 out of 10. I just pretty much had mixed feelings in every area on this game. Not that these feelings were equal, the game is still fun, so overall I would say this is a more good experience than it is a bad experience. There is just a lot that also felt frustrating though, and especially things that felt like it slowed the game down quite a bit, because with the backtracking of having to go back and forth between the various maps, and oftentimes not even knowing where exactly you're supposed to go, it just made for some unnecessary slowing down of the game that just didn't feel right. And even though I found Hexen a little on the disappointing side, it is still worth a play. This is particularly true since with the Heretic Hexen re-release you get both games. Truth is, you may prefer one over the other depending on what you enjoy in games like these. Maybe you'll be like me and prefer Heretic, but you may just be one who likes the darker, more atmospheric world of Hexen a little better. Either way, Hexen is a good game, and this collection is well worth your time, no matter which game you wind up preferring.
My servants can smell your blood, human.